Assalamu alaikum and welcome to session 106 of the Harwan Islamic Studies Circle HISC Seerah sessions, where we're continuing with the Battle of Uhud. This is the fourth session on the Battle of Uhud and related activities. Last week briefly we covered how the Prophet ﷺ, having done Shura with the people of Medina, put on 2 coats of armour, marches out with 1,000 followers. At the front of the Muhajirin is Musab ibn Umair. The Aus was led by Usayd bin Khudair, and Al-Khubab bin Al-Mundhir was leading the Khazraj battalion. And the Prophet ﷺ, he had to send back some of the very youngsters, those under 14, apart from a couple. Then in a strategic move designed to maximise discord and demoralisation of the Muslim army, Abdullah ibn Ubay, he retreats with 300 of his followers, and people like Abdullah bin Haram were were chastising, saying, "Look, why are you going back?" But his plan was to sow discord amongst the Muslims. Banu Haritha and Banu Salama, they almost went along with Abdullah ibn Ubay and retreated, but Allah strengthened their resolve. Then they continued and found off the beaten path route led by a guide to Uhud, so that the Quraishi scouts wouldn't see that they're out marching towards Uhud, because the Quraishis would obviously wanted to appoint a battle on their terms. But if the Muslims go out and camp somewhere else, the Quraysh are forced to meet them wherever the Muslims are. So that was the plan. So they camped by Uhud, and we'll talk about the Prophet ﷺ, how he stationed the archers on the mount, and how he positioned the army. We had Al-Mundhir on the right flank, Az-Zubair and Al-Miqdad both on the left flank, which would be the critical flank, the weaker flank, and the flank that's facing Khalid bin Walid. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he, not at this time, but in other hadith, he's been praising the Mount of Uhud. So getting to just before the battle, and so what I'd said that we would do, I'm looking over onto my right here, because what we said we would do is just show some maps, just so that we can orientate ourselves in terms of the coming week or 2 or 3 weeks, where we will actually look at the fighting and how it ensued, and so we've got a sense of the battle, because it's one thing reading it from books. For people who've had the benefit to go out to Medina and to see the plains around Uhud, you've got a sense of what the battleground is like. So I'll just kick off. Let me pause this and then I'll switch the camera. So here you've got sort of very broad basic outline of where Medina and Uhud is. So here you've got Mount Uhud at the top here. So you can see Mount Uhud actually is a huge sort of mini mountain range, and it's essentially bigger than Medina was at the time. And so what you've got down here is the direction towards Makkah, whereas Medina is there in the middle. So what what sort of just briefly want to show is that obviously we've talked before about how there are 2 volcanic tracks protecting the inhabitants of Medina. There's the Prophet ﷺ's mosque in the center of Medina. There's Masjid al-Quba, so the Prophet ﷺ coming up from Makkah, that's where he built the first, laid the foundations for the first mosque. these crosses are all the mini settlements and forts, that fortifications that were in and around Medina at the time. And then south, you've got sort of the swamp and date palm areas. So again, for an army, it's difficult for them to attack from either of these sides, and that's the natural fortification. So they have to swing around and come from this angle. At the very north, as I say, is the mountain range of Uhud. And the Prophet, he didn't take the direct route to there. He went through a different route, getting a guide and finding himself a secret route where the Quraishi army couldn't find out where they're going. Here, if I'll just sort of zoom back a bit. So here is essentially the battleground. So again, here's Mount Uhud, and it's got this little lip that comes out here. So the Muslims came, and that's where the Muslims camped. So the Prophet camped at the rear, so he's protected on his right side, on his rear by the mountainside, and the Muslims are camped in front. Here's the mountain where the archers were placed, and then so this sort of forces the Quraysh, when they arrive, to camp here. So their Medina is down this way. So the Prophet ﷺ, he's sort of turned his back on the mountain of Uhud, and he's facing Medina. So when the Quraysh arrive with their 3,000 strong army, they have to camp here, set up here. At the rear, they've got their women folk right at the back of the camp. Their cavalry, you've got Khalid bin Walid on the right flank of the Quraysh, you've got Ikrimah Abi ibn Jahl on the left flank. Abu Sufyan is obviously in charge of the overall army. So they camped face to face like this, and it's only because the Prophet ﷺ and his 700 men have forced the fact that this is the area where the fighting will occur. And so the Prophet ﷺ's sort of got this sort of, he's able to sort of control the battlefield because of how he's camped, and making sure that the fighting only occurs in and around this area. So their numerical advantage doesn't give them that much of a tactical advantage when it comes to the fighting, because there's only this short area where the hand-to-hand combat can occur. But obviously there's a weakness on this side, and the Prophet ﷺ then obviously on the left flank of the Muslims. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he stations his 50 archers here with express instructions: do not leave here. Even if we're winning, don't lose. Even if we're losing, don't move. Don't, even if you see the vultures, don't move until I send word of you. Obviously, the Prophet there's a slight, risk to himself because he's in a cornered place. So, should things go sour, he's not got an easy means of escape. So that's a tactical consideration that he had to employ. So, and again, the archers, their main job is to stop the Quraysh attacking from this side. So what obviously happens is you have the mubaraza, you have the dueling, and then you have the Muslims charging here when the battle starts, which we'll do today, and that disperses the Quraysh. Then, just sort of moving across down here, what we have is, just bear with me a second. So moving across down here, just a quick again, map of where things are. When the battle happened, you've got the main bulk of the Muslims charging out here, killing lots of the Quraish in between here. The Quraish having to flee in all directions, so much so that the women who were camped at the back, they're having to flee as well. And there's recordings of them sort of hitching up their skirts, and you can see their anklets as they're running off. Then the critical thing is obviously the 50 archers become 10, because 40 of them, seeing the initial rout of the Quraysh by the small number of Muslims, they come down off the little mountain. So the Prophet, he's only got a few people sort of protecting him around where the mountain is. So then what we find is Khalid bin Walid, he's on the right flank here. He then swings around, and he as he's retreating, he takes up a position in this little ravine. When he sees the archers descending, he then sees that as his sort of tactical advantage with his cavalry. He then charges in here. Well, first of all, he obviously goes there and overruns the mountain. So he's got the higher ground. Then he sweeps round, and then he attacks the Prophet and the Muslims there, and then he starts attacking the Muslims there. So the Muslims are then in a very difficult position, because they're being attacked from the rear. Some of the Quraysh then obviously turn back and start attacking the Muslims, and there's utter chaos. And again, there's not many places where the Prophet can go, because he's pinned in. So then he has to retreat up the mountain and then find a little crevice in Uhud, which is about here as part of his retreat. And then, as I say, Khalid bin Walid with his 100 or so cavalry gets other Quraysh to come and support him, and that's essentially sort of where the tide turns. So this was just sort of to get an orientation, inshallah. Hope that's clearer. If not, happy to answer questions. Right, so that's the maps, very sort of briefly. So again, just bear those things in mind over the next couple of weeks when we go through the battle, just in terms of how the orientation is, and where the Muslims and the Quraysh are, and sort of the ebb and flow of the battle. So you can see the critical importance of the mountain for the archers, and that is that the potential weakness, tactical weakness, is on the left flank, and again that's why you've got Az-Zubair bin Al-Awwam and Al-Miqdad protecting the left flank. And then the squadron of archers led by Abdullah bin Jubair bin Al-Numan. And again, the Prophet is able, as I just mentioned, to maximize the effectiveness of his 700 army, or more importantly, to minimize or mitigate the numerical superiority of the Quraysh army by forcing the fighting to be in the section and area that we just explained. And again, Uhud is well outside of Medina. It's the actual mount of Uhud it's a huge mountain range, and that's probably what happened. Again, if you've had the fortune to be invited to go there, you can get a good orientation of that. Although it's said that the actual mountain of the archers was probably much taller than it is now. It's probably been eroded by all the visitors, the pilgrims over the years. So much like Safa and Marwa were at the time of Prophet ﷺ and before that, much taller than they are now. So they have themselves been eroded over time. So we're getting to the beginning of the battle now. So the Prophet ﷺ, he gave express orders to the army that they're not to launch the offensive until he personally gives the order. Then he is like he does before the battles. He's using motivational techniques to get them to be in the right frame of mind, to get them to focus, get them to believe in themselves, be able to fight. He spurs them on to sort of show stamina and steadfastness, and as part of his technique, he takes out his sword and then he brandishes it about, and then he goes, so who is ready to take this sword? Everyone sort of jumps up. So you had Hamza volunteering, you had Ali volunteering, you had Umar ibn al-Khattab volunteering. They all wanted the sword. Then he repeats the question, who's ready to take this sword and give it its proper due, give it its haqq, its rights? And then everyone fell silent, and then one of them, Abu Dujana, who we'll talk about a lot more, Abu Dujana Samak bin al-Qarsha, he said, "O Messenger of Allah, what is the haqq of the sword? What's its proper due?" And the Prophet ﷺ said, to strike the enemy's faces with the sword, until the sword is bent. So, people like Az-Zubair bin Al-Awwam, who'd wanted the sword of the Prophet ﷺ, they all sort of were a bit, reticent. But then Abu Dujana, he said, "Okay, Messenger of Allah, I will take it for that price." So he was given the sword, and Az-Zubair, which we'll come on to in a second, inshallah, he was quite upset because he wanted the sword, and the Prophet ﷺ, chose Abu Dujana for this task, and Az-Zubair didn't know much about Abu Dujana, so this was a sort of he felt bad about this, so then Abu Dujana took the sword. He got his red headband out, his and sort of put his red turban on, and it was known as the turban of death. So whenever Abu Dujana would put on his red turban headband, it's like making a statement. He is going to fight fiercely to the death. That's what it meant. So it's a way of marking out his intent. So then Abu Dujana, he takes the sword, and then as both armies are facing off each other, he takes the sword and he's strutting his stuff with the sword unsheathed, and really brandishing it around, and walking with a stagger, strutting, between the lines, with his sword. And the Prophet ﷺ, he then looks over to Abu Dujana and he goes, this type of walking where you've got your chest puffed up and you're strutting arrogantly, with the sword, he goes, this type of walking Allah detests, except in a situation such as this. So there's a time and place. The only time when you can be so arrogant in your walk is a time of warfare like this. Other times, as Muslims, because the characteristic of the ummah is one of haya, of shyness, of modesty, we're not allowed to walk with arrogance. So that's sort of one way of motivating the army. Then on the Meccan side, you've got Abu Sufyan, who is, as we said, taken personal charge of the army. So he's sort of in the center. On his right flank, he's given Khalid bin Walid charge of the cavalry, and we said on the left flank you've got Ikrimah bin Abi Jahl on the left flank. Safwan ibn Umayyah were in charge of the infantry. These three, Khalid, Ikrimah and Safwan, good friends amongst themselves, but again they had lost their fathers during Badr, so it was really important that they are there leading the charge, and this is what they wanted to do. And then Abu Sufyan placed Abdullah ibn Abi Rabia as commander of their archers. And then he'd given the standard to Bani Abdad-Dar. Now, Bani Abdad-Dar, they were, when Qusay bin Kilab, and we talk about the 6 generations of Prophet's ancestry, so Prophet the son of Abdullah, going all the way back, you've got all the way coming back to by Abdul Muttalib, going back to Qusay, who was the one who took over Makkah from the tribe that had occupied Makkah for a few hundred years. And Qusay, when he'd taken over, he'd distributed the tasks for the authorities amongst his children, and given them to the different tribes. So you had the parliament, the Nadwa given to one tribe. Bani Abdad-Dar, they would always have the honor of the standard for war. Another tribe was given the obligation to feed the pilgrims, etc., etc. So Bani Abdad-Dar, they'd always had this duty, this honor, to be the standard bearers. But then Abu Sufyan, he was saying, look, and again, he's had this recounted to him, he wasn't physically there. He said, look, because of what you guys did in the Battle of Badr, where you'd lost the standard, you'd given up, that's why we lost. So essentially, on the day of Badr, and he said basically, you've been assigned as bearers of our standard, and you know that the first thing to fall is the standard, and that's the thing that enemy attacks. And should it fall, we fall down too. Therefore, I say to you, guarantee its safety, the standard, or leave it with us, and we will certainly suffice you that task. So basically, he's psychologically, trying to psych them up to say, look, you've only got one job, and that is to look after the standard. And because the standard of war, that's where the army, the opposing army, focuses their attack, whoever's bearing the standard. Because if the standard falls, then it gives the impression that the army's being defeated. So it's imperative that the standard is held aloft. So again, whoever's bearing the standard, he's at personal risk, because he's holding the standard and he can't really fight with one holding a huge standard and then having the sword. So he needs a protective entourage as well. Musa, who's going to have the Muslim standard, the Quraish are going to go for him, and the Quraish are going, and the Muslims are going to go for Bani Abdad-Dar, who have got this standard. So they say, you want us to deliver the custodianship of the standard, hand it over to you. This is our job. Tomorrow we will fight them, and you will witness our deed. So they're promising that they will look after the standard, and essentially they kept to the promise, and it's said that all 10 of the high-ranking people of Bani Abdad-Dar who were holding the standard, they were slaughtered in the initial Muslim attack. So again, The next thing, much as they did with Badr, they tried to divide and rule the Muslims. So the Quraysh then had a couple of ploys during this face-off, where Abu Sufyan, much like Ibn Rabi'a did at the Battle of Badr, saying that basically our quarrel is only with the Muhajir, the Qurayshis. Abu Sufyan, he sends a messenger who sort of goes to within earshot of the Muslims, and he goes, Abu Sufyan has told me to tell you to leave us alone, to fight our cousins, do not interfere, stand aside, we're not going to fight you, addressing the Ansar. For fighting you is not our aim or our target. So again, blatantly lying. They just want to cause dissension amongst the Muslim ranks, demoralize them. They've probably heard about Abdullah ibn Ubay going back. Maybe they were in on the plot, and Allah knows best. And they're trying to say, look, this is us against the Qurayshis. We're not going to quibble with the Ansar. So, you've got 3,000 in Abu Sufyan's army, about 700 in the Muslims, and of those, little over 100 are Quraishi and the Muhajirin. And so this, obviously, if the Ansar were to think on a tribal level, seeing this huge army in front of them and go back, then that would be game over, and that was the plan. But the Ansar, said no to that. They're going to hold, their faith firm as mountains. Then, that messenger failed. So then, there's someone called Abu Amir. In the times of Jahiliyyah, he was known as Abu Amir the monk Al-Sayfi. So Abu Amir Al-Sayfi. So he was at the same level, it said, as Abdullah ibn Ubay. So these guys, they'd survived the Battle of Bu'adh. They were amongst the senior most people in Medina when the Prophet ﷺ arrived. So when the Prophet ﷺ arrived, Abu Amr bin Al-Sayfi, he decided to leave. He said, look, I'm not going to stay in Medina. I'll go to Makkah and I'll plot my revenge, and I'll come back and I'll take over what is rightfully mine. Whereas Abdullah ibn Ubay, he played it the other way around, tried to stay within Medina, infiltrate society, and work to undermine the Prophet and the Muslim rule from within, by becoming a fifth column or a head of the hypocrites, as he became. So, and he was known as the monk because he was revered by his tribe. So then, he was at head of the Aus at the time. So then he was, as I say, given this name, Abu Amr al-Sayfi. When he'd gone to Makkah, then the Prophet ﷺ gave him a new name, a traitorous name, and Abu Amir Al Fasiq, right? So then he approaches his people. So again, he's got this mentality that he's still revered by his Aus, by his tribe, and whatever he'll say, they'll believe him and they'll obey him. And this is probably what he's been telling Abu Sufyan, that wait till we get there, I'll show you the hold I have on my people, I show you how much they care for me, how much of a leader I am. And for the last year, he's or two, he's been bigging himself up. So now's his chance. He goes to and he addresses his people, and he goes, I am Amir bin Sayfi, and as soon as he says, "O my kinsfolk of Aus, I am Abu Amir," their reply immediately, before he could carry on to say what he was actually going to say, He says no. The reply almost unanimously from the Ansar, that the call came out, no eyes of anybody shall be consoled by viewing you, O Fasiq. Right? And then he was astounded and shocked that his people could have said something, so disrespectful of him. He was not expecting that. So before he could actually start to talk to them and bring up their kinship, bring up their sort of bonds of old, he had to sort of scuttle away with his tail between his legs, and then he goes back to Abu Sufyan. And he goes, I don't know what happened. My people have been afflicted by an evil after my departure. That's his only way of explaining it. That, how could they turn their back on their leader? Their tribal allegiances. So these two attempts of the Quraish to disunite or cause division amongst the Muslim ranks didn't work. So then they knew that the fighting was going to happen. So then you had the Quraishi women who were at the back, camped at the back, then going between the lines of their 3,000 army, led by the wife of Abu Sufyan, so it's a family affair, Hind bin Utbah. So she's wandering amongst the rows with her sort of tambourines and her drums, and she's encouraging the men to fight. So again, it's psyching them up. So that's partly why they brought the women along. And Prophet, his job was to get the Muslims in the right frame of mind to psych them up. This was their job, to psych them up. So they sort of came up with poetry. They came up with phrases talking about being heroes, being brave swords people, being brave spear throwers, brave fighters, brave archers. And some of their chanting is recorded. Bani Abdad-Dar, home of the defender, strike with your sharp swords. And another sort of verse, it's, if you fight bravely, we will embrace and unfold our welcome mats to you. But if you flee from the battlefield, we will leave you, desert you, and no more love you. So again, it's tugging on their emotions. So you've got them on that side, and the Muslims. Every battle they have a chant. So the Muslim chant was to the death, to the death, to the death. I seek death, I seek death. So again, you've got a contrast in how both armies are approaching this. So then, as we talked before in the Battle of Badr, and as was the norm at the time, you would have a face-to-face combat, a duel, before the actual fighting between the armies. And again, this is a morale booster for one side opposed to the other. So they would send a champion to commence the duel. So the first to fight was the standard bearer of Bani Abdad-Dar, and that's Talha bin Abi Talha al-Abdari. So he steps forward. We'll just briefly mention that one of the chap that we just mentioned, Abu Amir Al Fasiq, his son is fighting on the other side, and we'll talk about him perhaps next week, inshallah. Abu Hudayfa, and Hamdullah, and so Hamdullah, he is the one who is Ghasil al-Malaika. He's the one who's washed by the given ghusl by the angels. I'm going to talk about that story, but again, you've got Abu Amr on one side, you've got his son fighting on the other side. So getting back to the combat. So the standard bearer, Talha bin Abi Talha, his nickname was the Ram of the battalion. So again, he's known to be a fierce fighter. So he comes forward on his camel, and then he challenges the Muslims to single combat, arm-to-arm combat. There's a difference of version. One version has Ali, another version has Az-Zubair bin Al-Awwam as being the one who faced him off. So So then, so the Muslim champion Az-Zubair, he steps forward, and then Talha bin Abi Talha, sort of they're facing off between the two camps, and then Talha, he takes his sword and he swipes down, initiates the combat, and then he has a go at Az-Zubair, and then it's Az-Zubair or Ali in the other version, in a single swift move. So again, you've got to be a proper warrior who's been practicing this, who's been fighting before, to do this move, where as soon as the other person raises his sword and is about to bring it down, you take your shield to block off that sword and that blow, and you hide behind the shield. At the same time, you take your own sword and then you start its momentum. So, and that's got to be essentially one sort of fluid movement. So as Talha brings down his sword, it sort of bounces off or gets stuck in the leather sword of Az-Zubair, and then Az-Zubair with his other hand, he glances that off, and his momentum of his movement in sort of thrusting the shield up and twisting, what he does with in that sort of one movement, he then brings the sword down and he essentially chops off Talha's leg below his armor. So Talha's got essentially full body armor down to his thighs. So the point of contact is best done below the armor. So again, Az-Zubair could see that, so he blocks off the blow and simultaneously chops off his Talha's leg. And again, these swords, and for those who've been or used a sword, well, that's fine. These are, or you've seen these in museums. These are big, heavy swords. So when you flail them, with all your body weight, they can slice through virtually anything. And again, in the stories of Badr and some of the other battles, you can see, we have stories of people being sliced in two, because of the weight of the sword and the momentum and the full power that is brought. It'll slice through, anything. So with that, Talha sort of defeats him, and in the other version, when Ali fights him, Talha's obviously his legs, being chopped off. He falls back, and then he's fallen onto the ground. And because his armor is just down sort of to his thighs, he falls to the ground, and his all his legs and his below parts are exposed. And then, from being arrogant and challenging the Muslims, he's now essentially begging Ali for forgiveness, and then Ali, being sort of the noble warrior, just left him there, and he died later on. The poor defenseless chap had his leg chopped off, begging Ali, "Look, we're cousins, don't kill me." But in the other version, Az-Zubair, when he's done that, the Prophet ﷺ, he shouts, "Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest," and all of the Muslims, they're chanting Allahu Akbar, because again, this is the two champions getting together, and it's good for morale for the Muslims. So then the Prophet ﷺ, he praised Az-Zubair, and he goes that, and we'll see the fruits of this later on, inshallah. He goes, every prophet has a disciple, and Az-Zubair is a disciple of mine. So essentially, although they've got followers, they have some key disciples, some special people with some sort of chosen tasks. So the Prophet says that his disciple is Az-Zubair. Then essentially we have the fighting. It's not recorded, but obviously the Prophet earlier on said, "Do not charge until I say." But obviously, then the charge happened once the Mubaraza, the hand-to-hand duel finished. So then the two parties engaged, and again, because of the positioning of the Muslim army against the Quraishi army that we saw on the diagram, the Muslims were able to sort of charge and basically cut through the Quraysh, much like sort of a knife in butter or something, a hot knife in butter. There seemed to be very little resistance. So again, the charge would be focused, as it is in these battles, upon the standard and whoever's carrying the standard. So then sort of there'd be like focused, arrow-like, going straight for the standard and the standard bearers, and then just trying to sort of make sure the standard falls, essentially. So then, because the standard, Talha was the standard bearer from Bani Abdad-Dar, his brother Uthman takes the standard. So they need to. They've already promised that Bani Abdad-Dar they're going to keep the standard fine, unlike in Badr. So Talha's brother Uthman takes the standard, and then starts chanting. The standard bearer has the right to dye its shaft in blood till it be beaten by his hand. Then you've got three main people from the Muslim army targeting Bani Abdad-Dar and the standard bearers. You have Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, you have Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then there's someone called Quzaman, which we'll talk about. So then Hamza attacks Uthman, Talha's brother, and deals him a blow, cuts his arm, cuts his shoulder, and then sort of stabs him in his navel, and opens him up so you can see his lungs, it said, and covered his lungs. So Hamza's there in the middle of the fray, fighting as Hamza has come to fight. Then the standard was raised by Abu Sa'id bin Abi Talha, but then it said that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas targeted him with a deadly arrow, shot him, and then sort of he dies, pinpoint accuracy. So Abu Sa'id ibn Abi Talha, he dies because the arrow sort of got him in the throat, and it said that his tongue then sort of flopped out because of that. Then, or in another version, it said that Abu Sa'd, when he got the standard, Ali went forth and met him and finished him off, or it could have been a combination of both in terms of the arrow and Ali giving the final death blow. Then it's recorded Musafi bin Talha bin Abi Talha got the standard, and he was shot by an arrow by Asim bin Thabit. Then Musafi's brother Kilab bin Talha bin Abi Talha picked up the banner, lifted it up, but Az-Zubair bin Al-Awwam, the Prophet's cousin who wanted the sword, he attacked him and managed to kill him. And then their brother Al-Jalas bin Talha bin Abi Talha lifted up the banner, but then Talha bin Ubaidullah got to him and stabbed him to death. And then another version says, Asim bin Thabit was the one who also, finished him off. So you've got 6 people here picking up the standard and essentially being killed, and all of them from the house of Abi Talha, Abdullah bin Uthman bin Abdad-Dar. Then another man from a different household from Bani Abdad-Dar called Talha bin Sharhabil. He then picked up this standard, and he was killed by Ali bin Abi Talib. Others say it was Hamza, but again, in the fray of the battle, essentially he got killed, whether it was Hamza or Ali, different reports. Then Ardat dropped the standard, obviously. Then Shurayh bin Qariz, he picked up the standard, and he was killed by someone called Quzaman. Then Abu Zayd Amr bin Abdul Manaf al-Abdari, he took the standard, and then he too was killed by Quzaman. And then a son of Sharhabil bin Hisham bin al-Abdari, he picked up the standard, and then Quzaman killed him as well. An interesting thing about Quzaman, and we might mention it later on, is that the Muslims were seeing Quzaman fighting, and they were really proud of his fighting. And then, the reports would come back to the Prophet like, look at the bravery of Quzaman. And whenever they mentioned Quzaman, the Prophet said, "An-nar," the fire. And then when it mentioned, his name was mentioned again, he's fighting so bravely, the Prophet again said "An-nar," so the fire. So some of the Muslims didn't understand. Here you've got Quzaman fighting so valiantly and bravely, and whenever we mention his name, the Prophet said "Nar," and so it said that one of them went and snuck up on him, tried to find out why was this, and a couple of reports are that essentially they asked him, are you essentially fighting for the honor of the Muslims? This was when he was injured. Are you fighting for the honor of the Muslims, or are you fighting for the honor of your tribe? And Quzaman says, no, I am fighting for prestige, as a brave warrior, for myself and my tribe. He's not there to defend Islam. That's why he's going to be punished in hellfire. His intention was wrong completely. And again, this is a key thing. Those people, he's saying, every action is judged according to his intention. So outwardly, he's doing a valiant action, but his intention's completely wrong. And Allah knows what's your intention. So all the good deeds that we do, if we're doing them just for show, to show we're a brave warrior, to show we're a good da'i, to show we're a good qari, to show that we're a good Muslim, a good fundraiser, doing all of these things for the wrong reasons, it's very bad. And here someone ultimately lost his life on the battlefield, essentially for nothing, because his intention was wrong. So, that was a lesson to the Muslims there, going back to the Prophet saying, how brave is Quzaman? And the Prophet said, look, his ending is in the fire. So here you've got Bani Abdad-Dar staying true to their promise. They will hold on to the standard. All 10 of the standard bearers were annihilated. Right? None of them were able to then carry the standard, and then one of their slaves then picked up. The slave's called Sawab. He picked up the standard, and then his hand was cut off. So he knelt down and sort of embraced the barrier, leaned it against his chest, and then he remained fighting. And then he was slain, and just his last breath was, "Oh Allah, have I been excused?" Then once this slave Sawab had died, that was it. There was no one else to pick up the standard. The Quraish could see that their standard had fallen. This was, as I say, this is where the Muslims had concentrated their attack. This was the centre of the bitter fighting on the battlefield. And again, if you put that in the heat of the battle, the Quraysh getting disheartened, the Muslims chanting in their rows, "I see death, I see death, I see death." This is their their motto, you can see the sense of panic amongst the Quraish. Finally, for today, just to talk about Abu Dujana, the one who took the sword of the Prophet to give it its right. So he put on his red turban, he's there, he's fighting with his red turban, fighting with the sword of the Prophet and he's doing as he's been tasked to do, slaughtering left, right and centre, dispersing the ranks of the Quraysh. And then Az-Zubair bin Al-Awwam, we got him narrating an honest story. He said, look, I felt angry and discouraged when the Messenger of Allah, his own cousin, refused to give me the sword, even though I'm a brave warrior. I felt angry and discouraged that he didn't give me the sword, but he gave it to this person called Abu Dujana. So he said to myself, I am the paternal cousin. He's a cousin of the Aunt Sophia. I am a Quraishite. And besides, I was the first who demanded the sword, yet he favoured Abu Dujana over me. By Allah, I will watch to see how he uses it. So you can see there's this thing in his heart, even though Abu Dujana is on his side, fighting, for him, for the Prophet he feels this pride that I should have been given the honour of having the sword. Who is this Abu Dujana? Why has he got this sword? I'm going to keep an eye on him. So he followed, and Abu Dujana is easy to see. He's got the red headband on, the red turban. So he stands out in the crowd. But he sees Abu Dujana. He's staying true to that. He's got the headband of death on. He's fighting and he's slaying people left, right, and centre. And then he says out loudly, I am the one who my intimate friend made covenant with. Right? So we were there under the palm trees on the mountainside. The covenant that we made was that I should fight. I should not fight at the rear, but that I fight at the front heroically with the sword of Allah and His Messenger. So, and it's reported that no one stood in the way of Abu Dujana but was killed. And then Az-Zubair could see that there was a Quraishi who was actually fighting quite bravely. So he made dua that Abu Dujana should meet this Quraishi, so that they would be face to face. And obviously they're killing people left, right, and they're killing people in front of them. Like you see in the films, these two heroes, they know who are the brave warriors, so they sort of get drawn to each other, in this noble battle of warriors. So they did exchange two sword strokes. The Quraishi put down his sword. It got stuck in the leather shield of Abu Dujana, so his sword is stuck in that, and then so Abu Dujana with one thrust of his sword basically cut him in two. And then Abu Dujana, he tells a story later on how he notices there's one soldier on the battlefield really urging and encouraging the Qurayshis to fight. So he said, look, I've got to target that soldier, because they're the ones who really geeing up the Qurayshis to go and fight. So he goes up and then he sort of stands over this person and he raises his sword, and then that sort of he thought the soldier, she turns to see that it's Abu Dujana, so she cries out like the Arab women used to cry, the ululation, where they cry, the ululating cry essentially. So it's very distinctive, and again, it's you'll come across it if you Google it. But the ululation that the Arab women have. So she gave out this ululation, and then Abu Dujana saw that this was Hind bin Utbah. So then he put down this sword, and he goes, I respect the sword of the Prophet too much to use it on a woman. So that's that's some of the stories of Abu Dujana. Inshallah, next week, because we're getting on quite a bit, it's nearly an hour now, I'll talk about Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib and the assassination of Hamza. So this is still in the first phase of the battle. Three phases. There's the first phase, which is where the Muslims are winning. The second phase, where Khalid bin Walid attacks and surprises the Muslims, and the third phase, which is the retreat and some would say the tactical defeat of the Muslims. So we're still in the first phase of fighting. So inshallah, I'll finish there. Do remember us in your du'as. Do pray for the ummah. Do make any comments on this video. Do like it, do share it, do subscribe, do read the books of Seerah. Do read the story of Uhud and some of the bravery, the stories of bravery that we have, inshallah. So until next time, inshallah, take care. وَلَسَوْ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. جزاك الله خير everybody. Assalamu alaikum.